lady, but is she gone?
Oh, is
American history.
Yeah, is she gone?
The other teacher ahead of me is gone. Yeah,
Oh,
my
did
class
her?
begins in about 5 minutes. Hers ended 10 minutes ago.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna, this is.
This is survey of U.S. history, right?
Okay. I hope so.
This is survey of U.S. history, right?
Yes, but
That's what it comes up as an icon, right?
what it is, it really bothersome to me, the art department too. It's the whole semester from the American Indians to Trump.
Okay.
And I wish it were just from the American Indians to the Civil War. And then another course for the Civil War.
What about this is up to 1500s?
Oh, no, wait, no. Come on, let's get our act together. The world history class is up to 1500.
Oh, okay, that's what
This is American. The American history barely begins at 1500. Barely is started at 1500. Well, we start with the American Indians. We start with American Indians and go from there. Is that clear enough? This class. All right, now, if you're confused, I hope before the class is over, what I'm going to do, I'm going to start talking about the American Indians and go from there to chapter 1, the northern, then to chapter 2 and 3 and 4, and so on and so forth, and see how far I can get. Here it is. My class worksheet. Yeah, this is American History 2110132.
Yes.
CRN 53238. It goes from the American Indians to Donald Trump. Yeah, and it's impossible to do it justice in 7 lectures. Impossible, but I've got to try. And hey, I don't mean to be disparaging. It's just, this is what, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do my best. Wait, I thought I'd turned that thing off.
So how many students we got in this class?
Huh?
9? Oh, wow.
Why does that thing not come on? Well, see, these things cost $200 a piece to replace the bulbs, and I'm trying my best to get it off, and it won't come off. Try again. Well, now I've got another idea. Wait, did I get it off? Well, all of you know, I tried. You do too, no input. Okay, well, I'm going to start. It's 1 o'clock. Okay. They tell us to turn those things off. We're not using them as a bolts, but I tried. There's I'm waiting on the recording right now. Nobody's here. Okay, this is a small class. Only 9 of you registered. That's okay. We'll make the most of it, and I'll do. Anyway, this is American history from the beginning to today. You know, basically from the American Indians to Donald Trump. I'm going to cover it as best I can. I don't care that much if I don't get it. If I don't get it all. All right. So I'll start from the beginning. Now, I don't expect many of you saw your syllabus. It was not put online until late yesterday. Part of the reason for that was I was never sure that I had this class. They told me at one point I had to have 12 pupils. They'd cut it. I don't have 12 pupils, but they never cut it, so that's good. They also, being part-time, I'm always running a risk that some full-time teacher is going to take my class from me, except for one thing. No full-time teacher wants to teach on Friday. So one thing, though, I've learned about Friday students. Generally, students who would come out to a class on Friday are more motivated and better than students who don't. So that means that you might have some tough competition in here, folks, if you're here. Yeah, the competition might be tough. I don't know. I won't know much about it. Now, the syllabus gives the dates of the test. The first test is 2 weeks from today. Let's see. All right. And for cover, let's see. Okay, I'm going to have to find that on the syllabus now.
You have it under the 15th.
What's that?
You have it under the 15th.
I have it on a Oh, okay, you've got the syllabus. Now let me see, what syllabus do you have? Just a minute, let me get over there. Which syllabus do you have? Okay, one. All right. She got the syllabus for this class.
So I saw the overview one, I tried to click on it, I got it 3 times, and I tried to click on it.
You probably, I'll tell you what I think happened. I think you tried to click on it when I was downloading it. Okay, I tried to download it before, then I had to go over. All right, so the first test is actually
Next week.
the 15th. Okay, thank you. Test 1 is on the 15th. Okay, next week. All right, test June. Thank you. All right, I'm glad somebody had the syllabus because I'm having a hard time getting it up on this computer. I'm having computer issues up here and I'm not going to hold up the class for it, so we'll move on. Okay. You might have noticed the little camera on the side. I have never recorded an American history lecture before, but I'm going to this time. I have several reasons for it. Number one, my department head, Mario Benick of a name, suggested I try to do something that would get you students to receive what you might receive in a 15-week class. And that's asking a lot for you. But I'm going to try to teach all the chapters in 7 weeks what you might receive in a 15-week class. So I'm going to do it. The other reason, and I'm really hesitant to say this, but I made a statement that I consider the truth last fall that really got one of my pupils really upset at me. And I decided, number one, if this is here, it might deter some student. But I'm not going to promise that I won't say things that will offend somebody. Here's the thing about it, folks. Here's the thing about it. The Constitution gives a person freedom of speech, but it does not protect you from hearing things you don't want to hear. The American Constitution does not protect you from offensive speech. Now, there was a case that happened. This actually happened. A man went in a Christian school to the president of college, complained about the chaplain. Well, what's the chaplain saying that offends you? This young man said, the chaplain is preaching against stealing, and I steal. and I'm offended. Well, you might be offended, and I probably won't be, because I have some ideas, like everybody does. I've been called opinionated, and some of the students in doing the reports already say there's some things I say that I might could leave out, but I don't think I should. All right. As for what I say that's offensive, you'll learn as I go along. But anyway, this is kind of to protect me, you might say, and also hopefully it'll benefit you. The test will cover the first 4 chapters, I believe, chapters 1 through 4, and it will be on mostly on the stuff that I write on the board. So take down careful notes. What I'm going to do is write down something on a board like Aztec. If you put down it was an Indian group, and you got to, where applicable, put your location. You have to put down lived in Mexico, and it was an Indian nation. The Aztecs are more than a tribe. Now, if you can put that much down, well, you don't have to write a 500-word essay about it, just that much. You'll be able to pass my test. Now, 2/3 of my pupils make A's and B's, and my department head knows that. Notice I started to call it department manager. That's because I spent 27 years at Lockheed. Department manager. Here we're department heads. All right, we're going to start from the beginning and move on. Now, I will go over the syllabus. Well, how many of you downloaded that? I mean, how many of you have the syllabus? That's not surprising. 2 of you. Okay. I'll tell you what happened to you. Did you try to download it before 5 o'clock yesterday?
No, I actually looked at it just now in the classroom upstairs right next to the one you were teaching, but I did look at it yesterday after
If you looked at it,
10 o'clock at night.
Oh, then it should have been right. At that point, it should have been right. Okay, I will look into it when I get home. I can't do it now, but I'll look into it. I mean, it should have been right.
Here, this is the one I got.
Okay, don't worry about it. I've got to move on. We've got a whole lot of ground to cover. But anyway, I'll go to the syllabus with you next week when more of you have it, and I will make sure it's the right one. Anyway, getting started. It's already about 9 minutes. I've shot up. All right. The American Indians. American history begins with the American Indians, who were the first inhabitants. Now, there's a little bit of controversy going on about these people. There are still young students who are taught that the American Indians were living here peacefully and living a blissful, happy life until the Europeans came in and destroyed their way of life and everything. The naughty old Europeans are very, very naughty and evil, and they destroyed the American Indians and drove them all west and took everything they had from them, took the land from them, and therefore the Europeans are very, very bad. I mean, you might have been taught this, and you have. I don't blame you for believing it, because this is what is being taught right now. One thing that is contrary to facts, and your book mentioned it, the American Indians were not living at peace among themselves. Their skulls that we find, no, their skeletons. We find their skeletons shows that their young men, when they were as addicted to warfare as anyone on the face of the earth, and a lot of their deaths were from obvious battlefield deaths. They died violently. The American Indians lived an average of 18 years. Now, folk, part of that was due to a high infant mortality rate, but that means that most of them did not even really grow up. Most of them were dead before they were 40. Now, if you think that's the ideal way to live, you're welcome to your opinions. I don't think that's the ideal way to live. Now, I had a young woman several years ago who tried to get me to say that the American Indians had the ideal life and they were the greatest people on the face of the earth. I would not agree with that. I never saw her again. She just quit into my class without talking about it. And by the way, if you want to drop my class, by all means, do so officially. The drop deadline is June 29, but don't just quit coming to class. But anyway, the average American Indian lived about 18 years. They did a lot of fighting among themselves. Now, there's also the teaching going around that the American Indians were great for the environment. If you actually read the book, they burned away, multiplied millions of acres of land, partly for their own protection. I mean, they didn't have the means to fight forest fires. But they burned, and they had a big impact on the environment, a lot of it negative. Their air that they breathed was dirtier than the air we're breathing now. They were not a clean air people. They were not a green people. They did a lot to, well, you might say, destroy their environment by burning away a lot of it. Of course, some of that they might not have burned away. It might have been lightning strikes that did it. I mean, we don't know. We don't have detailed records. They did not keep records, written records as such. So we don't know that much about the individuals. Now, one thing, when you're studying of American Indians, you're not studying about individuals. You're studying about tribes, perhaps, but we don't know the names of very many Indians until the Europeans came. Then we have famous Indians like Powhatan, his brother Opechecana, and women like Pocahontas. But these people would have been forgotten about had it not been for the coming over of the Europeans. Now, to me, I mean, I've already gone, I'm on record. I believe that the way the Indians were living was wrong. What was wrong with it in one word? The American Indians they lived in villages called communes. I mean, what we call commune. They were communist. Now this might shock some of you. You might say, what is there about a commune? All right, here's what they were. They had no private property. They had no money. They had no social class. Everybody was equal. Well, isn't this a great way to live? Personally, I don't believe in communism, so I can't say this. But anyway, yeah. But I mean, to each his own. But they were pure, out and out pure communist. No money, no trade, no private ownership of property. Again, was this the right way to live? Well, I don't think so. And to me, this is where communism leads. It destroys incentive. Among the American Indians, the lazy and unproductive got fed along with the hardworking and the productive. Every one of them got treated alike. The ones who worked and the ones who didn't all got fed. Each of you can make up your mind for yourself what you believe about that. But they lived this way. But they were not Marxist-Leninists. I mean, they believed in God. They called him the Great Spirit. They believed in spirits. Their religion was on the border, well, was what we might call animism. They worshiped nature. You know, the river was God, the trees were God. Every time they'd kill an animal to eat it, they would perform a ceremony called an apology. In other words, they'd say to this animal, we're sorry we're killing you, but we feel like we have to. They would perform an apology. Every time they cut down a tree or burned it, they'd perform an apology. But they lived in tribes, usually no more than about 150 or 200 to a tribe. And they just could not organize themselves in the nations. Now there was an instance, one is where about 2,000 of them accidentally bumped into each other one time and temporarily formed an alliance. And George Armstrong Custer did not realize what had happened at 2,000, and he tried to fight him with his 277 men and got himself wiped out, because he was not expecting to face thousands upon thousands of Indians. But this was the exception. And shortly after that, these Indians got to infighting among themselves, and they broke up, and they wound up being defeated peacefully. Anyway, they were living. I mean, I'm talking about the ones in North America. Were living in a lifestyle that we call communist. They were dying out in droves. Typically, this is another problem with socialism or communism. Their women did not want to have more than 1 or 2 babies per woman. And keep in mind, the babies, most of them did not grow up. They were on the verge of extinction. Now, if you think that the white man came along and killed them all off, the fact is, when the Europeans came over, the Europeans might have actually saved them from extinction. Had the Europeans not come over, the ones at least living above the Rio Grande might have all died out. Yes?
The Europeans also bring diseases with them that killed half of them out.
Yes, but also some of the diseases were caught by the Europeans from the Indians, so they went both ways. What you have, by the year is 1492. Let's say year 1492. What you have a big Atlantic Ocean. On one side is one group of people, on another side is another group of people, and they don't know each other exist. Inevitably, they're going to bump into each other. And what is going to happen inevitably is there's going to be all kinds of problems, including diseases, and there was no way known to prevent it. Now, granted, if they had bumped into each other in 1992, well, what I really believe, if Columbus had not discovered in 1492, Europe would never have advanced to where it has, and eventually Europeans, we'd still be driving stagecoaches and getting around in covered wagons, and we would not have automobiles or airplanes. So, again, I think that these things came about as a result of a group of people moving into this country. Yes, taking the land from the Indians, but in the meantime, building up, inventing airplanes and automobiles and telephone and telegraph and all this stuff. That would not have happened had it not been for. Again, this is a different side of the story than what you probably heard. The diseases were something that could not be helped. Now again, had they come over in 1992, assuming that Europeans would have made all the progress that they made, and that's unreal, assuming that the Europeans waited 500 years and never come across the ocean, and finally came across with their airplane automobiles and vaccinations, but that's not the way it happened. And I don't think it could have. Inevitably, they were going to discover each other. And inevitably, there was going to be a clash. There was a clash of ideologies, a clash of diseases. One of the problems, the American Indians in North America said, oh yeah, you white men can come and live with us, but don't set up your borders. And the Europeans said, no, we believe in borders. We believe in private property. Without private property, there would have been no such things as invented as airplanes, automobiles, radios, and televisions. The Americans don't realize their lifestyle, their way of living, was just simply not going to be conducive to technological advances. The American Indians would not have become, they would not have become technological advanced if they had 10,000 years. Because they were not heading in that direction. Now, the ones living south of the border, south of Rio Grande, at the time of Columbus, from the beginning, going all the way back to the Olmecs, I'm not going to ask you about it, but I'm going to mention the Mayans because they have been so. We have made a big discovery about the Mayans recently. We have found radar that can penetrate the jungle, call it rainforest, call it jungle, call it what you will. And we have found that their civilization extended into what is today overgrown with jungle, and they had millions more people than what we ever realized. And this is a recent discovery because of our radar, jungle penetrating radar. And we have found temples we didn't know exist, buildings and metropolises that we did not know existed, and they must have had a population that could have destroyed every European had they gone across the ocean. They had many, many more people than Europeans had. But they did not have the wheel. They did not have basic fundamental technology. Now, here's the thing about the Mayans and Aztecs and the Incas. These people were what we call civilized. They had large cities and large metropolises. They had diversity of occupation. They had writing. They had the trappings of civilization. But unlike a lot of other civilized people, they also practiced human sacrifice. Now, folk, I want to ask this, I always ask every class this question, and any of you don't have to participate if you don't want to. If you've never thought about it before, I'm not surprised. Supposing you had been part of Cortez's army, I mean, you'd been a European, supposing, and you'd been in Cortez, and you'd heard some hideous screams coming from the Aztec temple. Now, Cortez spoke through an interpreter. There was an Indian girl there who had the gift of learning languages. Some people have it, I don't. People who could learn a language really fast. Supposing you had heard that these screams of persons who are having their chests cut open and heart taken out as a sacrifice to the sun god, what would you have done? To the Europeans, this was a shock to their consciousness that civilized people behave this way. Now, I'll tell you what Cortez actually did. He went in throughout the region of Mexico and collected all the Indians who were discontent, organized into an army, and went in and overthrew Montezuma and overthrew the Aztecs, and stopped the human sacrifices. Was he wrong? I don't think so. You can, when I was a kid, we honored Christopher Columbus. The Latin American nations honored him. Today, he's looked on as being a mass murderer and a man who committed a lot of genocide and murdered millions of people and more people than anyone in history. Number one, he could not help the diseases. I mean, that was something that they did not know about and not prepared for. One of the diseases was smallpox. You may or may not know that persons who work around cattle never get smallpox. That's how we discovered the smallpox vaccination. The American Indians had no cattle. When smallpox hit the American Indians, it wiped out, and between smallpox and typhoid fever, wiped out 90% of the Indian population. That was not the fault of Columbus, except that he came over here and brought these diseases with him. It was an accident. Now, if you think it was Columbus's fault, you can say so, but he did not realize he was bringing it over. And also, it's been reported that syphilis was a disease that one of Columbus's crewmen carried back with him to Spain. Not Columbus himself, one of the crewmen. They picked it up from the American Indians. Again, you can make up your minds for yourself what you believe. I think that the clash that occurred between the European and the Indians was inevitable. And eventually, the two sides were supposing now that an Indian ship had decided to sail across the Atlantic and bumped into Europe and come back home with a few European captives. The same thing that did happen would have happened. Inevitably, there was going to be a clash. Because it was a clash of religion, a clash of worldviews, a clash of economics. Inevitably, there would be a clash, and it was almost inevitable that one side was going to come out on the bottom and the other side on the top. In the long run, there was no real way that the American Indians could win. Now, the first encounter that we know of that occurred between the Indians and the Europeans was the Vikings. The Vikings came over about the year 1000. The Vikings and Indians clashed, but even though the Vikings, they had helmets of steel, they had swords of steel, they had steel armor, or iron armor, iron swords. The Indians greatly outnumbered. And the Vikings had to leave Nova Scotia and go back to Greenland. Then they eventually went back home. Round one goes to the Indians. Okay. But then 500 years went by. During those 500 years, it is now known that numerous European fishing vessels crossed the Atlantic and fished off the waters of North America. They came into contact with the Native Americans, and they spread their diseases among the Native Americans and wiped without meaning to. There were no fights as such, because the Europeans knew they couldn't fight. The Indians outnumbered them until until the diseases wiped out big segments of the Indian population. This paved the way for what was to come after these 1500s. All right. By the time that Columbus arrived in 1492, there were not many Indians living north of the Rio Grande. Now, this great land that we call the United States and Canada, two countries that have all these natural resources, all this tin and iron and all this lumber and this coal, enough coal to last us 3,000 years, the American Indians did not use any of that. They were just sitting here with all this land doing absolutely nothing. And then when the Europeans came, they found a whole lot of empty, uninhabited land. You might say they should have stayed at home. But if you believe that, you're going against human nature. If you had lived in the 1500s, if you had not come across the ocean, your cousins would have, or your brother would have. The idea that the Europeans should have stayed home and let the Indians have it, that is going against everything that's human about us. We inevitably moved in. The Europeans moved in. The Indians living in Virginia, the first Europeans moved into Virginia. The Indians living in Virginia waited too long to fight them. By the time they started fighting, the Europeans outnumbered. And now, you might have heard, well, the reason the Indians lost, they didn't have guns, didn't have horses. Slightly wrong. In short order, after the Europeans arrived, the Indians did get the guns from the Europeans. They got the horses. They became excellent horsemen. In fact, the Indians in New Mexico learned how to use guns and horses so well that they kept the Spanish out. They were not conquerors. Then the Mexicans came along after the Spanish were driven out. The Mexicans could not conquer these Indians in New Mexico either. But then came the Americans. And the Americans came in such great numbers that the Indians had to succumb. But they had the rifles. They had the horses. But there was another problem that they had. You can call American Indian fighters, you can call them braves, but they were not soldiers. And I know you know the difference. They were braves, yes. They had the courage, they had the will to fight. And they were fighting on morally high ground. I mean, after all, the white man was not keeping his treaties, and hear that from the white man. And after all, the land had belonged to them first. So they were fighting on morally high ground. But a soldier fights as a team. The Indians would go into battle and they'd pick on somebody their own size. Maybe when one of them finished the other one off, then they'd look around and see who else. And if there's somebody bigger than them, well, no, they don't want to fight him. But they'd pick on somebody about their own size and fight him a while. And one of them would finish the other one off. That was their way of fighting.
No order, no hierarchy.
No order, no hierarchy. Again, if they had learned, they should have gotten abreast, man to man in a team, and you don't fight one of me without fighting all of me. They were not soldiers. In fact, they were so bad a soldier in World War I, General Pershing would not have him in his army. He fought them, but he wound up taking them in because not one German understood their language. And they would talk to each other in their own language. And then have an interpreter. And the Germans, if they were listening in, the Germans was known to wiretap the telephone and listen in on the radio conversations and couldn't understand a word. Not one German knew that. So that's actually the Indians were really disappointed. I mean, we're such bad people, you won't have us. Like I say, eventually Pershing took them in as signal soldiers. When I was in the army, I was a signal soldier, radio operator. And in Vietnam, the radio operators were the ones that got shot first. All right.
The radios when we
radio.
bought them, so we used them when we were in there.
Yeah, well, today's radios are much, much, much smaller than they once were. And, by the way, I turned this thing off before the top of this class. It's not going to go off. I've had it. I mean, I made a speech one time about self before I gave a test. The next thing I know, mine went off. That was terribly embarrassing. All right, leaving that. All right. Anyway, Now, there is another view, prevailing view, that the Europeans got what they have by stealing it from other people. All right, there's some truth to that, but here's what I call stealing. Stealing is where someone else has an airplane, you don't have it, someone else has the airplane. And let's say that the Chinese had the airplane, and Europeans sneaked in and took the airplane from the Chinese. Now the Europeans have the airplanes, the Chinese don't. That's my definition of stealing, except for one thing. From whom did Europeans steal the airplane? From whom did Europeans steal the radio? From whom did Europeans steal the automobile? From whom did Europeans steal penicillin?
Didn't want anyone.
What's that?
Technically speaking, didn't want anyone.
So therefore, the Europeans did not get where they got by stealing from other people. Now there was some stealing. I mean, you can call stealing. We stole a lot of gold from the Incas and we moved to Spain, but that was not done by Englishmen. But there was a lot of gold stolen from the Incas. So that helped, but nevertheless, that did not help us invent the airplane, the radio, the automobile. This was done by people who did not practice communism. All right, anyway, now, the standard view, backing up the beginning of history, is that the American Indians came across the Bering Strait. Now, if you take a look at your book, you have find a map that shows. I'm looking at page 31. That's not the best map. That map shows Europeans, but it shows Europeans coming across the Bering Strait. There are problems with that, though. I'll tell you. I'll show you another map that I have that I showed the other class. Right here. This is a world map, and it shows humanity starting in Africa and humanity then spreading across and going across. Now the Bering Strait is a narrow body of water that that almost joins Alaska to Siberia. They don't join. At one time, Alaska and Siberia might have been joined either because the Ice Age rose up or because the ocean levels were once less than they are now owing to a bigger ice chunk in Antarctica. And there might have been dry ground between Antarctica and Siberia. The problem with that is no Indian ever said that they came from across the Bering Straits. Every Indian who knew the story of where that they came from said they crossed the oceans, either the Atlantic or the Pacific. Now, personally, I think that they crossed the Atlantic. It is now known you can cross even the Pacific Ocean in a rowboat. There are certain places in the ocean where you can find fresh water, again, if you know where to look. You cannot drink seawater. And generally, you cannot fish in the middle of the ocean. Fishing is usually done in the shallower waters on the near land, but out in the deep ocean, the fish just don't swim like that near the surface, and it's hard to. Occasionally you might catch one, but mostly you don't fish in that deep. But it's known you can dry food and live on dried food and actually cross even the big Pacific Ocean in nothing more than a rowboat and even a kayak. If you handle a kayak the right way, they're practically unsinkable. The kayak can roll over and over, and the occupant survive. As long as you know it's not to breathe when it's upside down in the water. Otherwise, you can survive in a kayak. All right, but anyway, a lot of persons now believe that the Indians did cross both the Atlantic and Pacific. Now, I heard something recently. A lot of American Indians living in the western part of our country looked a lot like Mongolians, except they had red skin, but they looked like Mongolians. It is now believed that when Genghis Khan started to conquer Mongolia, a lot of Mongolians crossed the Pacific Ocean and came to the Americas in the 1100s. It is known that the Chinese crossed the Pacific long before Columbus, but the Chinese did not. The Chinese did not keep crossing. And keep in mind too, the Chinese had to cross 10,000 miles of ocean to get to California, whereas the Europeans had to cross 4,000 miles of ocean to get to the New World. So it was harder on the Chinese. The Chinese had another reason too. Their philosophers did a lot more than men. All right. Okay. I want to pause here for a minute and see who's here. Now again, if I mispronounce your name, feel free to correct me. Deetria. Okay. Lupita, I believe. Lupita. C-H-I-L. Chibuzo. Eric Price. J.C., I know G.C., I know it's here. Janae Reed. Sinai.
Let's go with side.
Say it.
Side.
Side. Willie Tran. Is Willie Tran here? Stephanie. Yeah, okay. NBC Zone. Okay, I know you're here. Okay, I'm missing two of you. Eric Price and Willie Tran. Okay, I will say this on behalf of the absences. Because of the nature of this class, I'm supposed to turn in no shows by the end of week 2. That is by Thursday, week 2. And guess what? This class only meets once before to turn the no show. That means that these persons who do not show for this class, and that does not apply to you. I'm going to have to turn them in as a no show, and they're going to have to sign a paper, or have to sign it to get it back in. So if you ever take a class that only meets once a week, remember, you must show up to the first class. Are we clear on that? All right. Again, you can miss. All right, I have a policy. It's on the syllabus. If you have to miss a class, you can make up for the test anytime, including the final exam. You can make it. You know, I'm willing to stay. Most of the time, I'm willing to stay after school. I can't make a special trip. I only come here on Fridays and don't ask me. Now, I had a student offer to pay me for the gasoline. I said, if I get caught accepting money from 1 year, I'll be fine. Yeah, I can't do it. But, you know, anyway. But I can't make a special trip for you. So, all right. So much for that. All right. So of the 9 of you, really only 7 of you are here. Okay, we'll move on. The American Indians did not have several things. They did not have the wheel. They did not have wheat, barley, oats, rye, basic grains. They also did not have livestock, the sheep, the cow, the pig, the horse, the camel, the goat, which indicates to me that they came over in very, very small craft.
That right.
Right, R-Y-E. Yeah. Okay, again, my bad handwriting. Hey, when I was teaching fifth graders how penmanship, I would quote the philosopher Plato, do as I say, but don't do as I do. My wife says I heard that, and sometimes quote that same thing. Do as I say, but don't do as I do. All right. Anyway, they did not have some big, and again, if they were to come over in bigger, now when the Europeans came, they came over in big enough vessels to bring these animals and plants with them. So the Europeans came and they bought their pigs, their cows, their horses, their camel. The only beast of burden that the Indians had was some of them in that area had a llama. Otherwise, they had no tame animals. Well, they did have the dog. Okay, they had the dog. Maybe they could bring their dogs with them, or maybe the dogs follow them across the barracks or whatever. They had the dog, but they didn't have the other. As far as I know, they didn't even have the cat. Those came from Europe also. But they had the. They didn't. They hunted deer and elk and moose, but again, and buffalo, but they could not tame any of these animals. Owing to the fact they were not civilized enough. Now, it's known that today we have farmers who will fence in buffalo and keep buffalo on their farms, but the Indians were not organized enough to do that. Now, without these animals, I mean, again, it indicates to me that they came over here with very, very sparse and they started life from scratch. Now, again, they did not have any inventiveness about them, whatever. I mean, didn't even have the wheel. So that means they didn't have the cart, the wagon, or any of the basic stuff that you would expect that people would have. But some of them did have civilization. In fact, some of the oldest civilizations that we know of, you might have been in South America long before the Europeans were civilized. That goes all the way back to the days of Sumer and Babylon and maybe ancient Egypt. There are persons who believe the ancient Egyptians came to the Americas, and the Phoenicians might have. But if they did not bring any of these animals with them.
So you said they had the lion and the dog?
They had the llama. Now, some of them did. Some of them. The ones in South America, the Inca had the llama. They used beasts, and they had the dog. But with the dogs, they were only good for hunting or protecting and barking when somebody was near. They were not. Now the Eskimos used dogs to transport their sleds. This was done even before the Europeans, sled dogs. The Eskimos were using that, so they did make use of the dog, but they didn't have the horse or the donkey or the mule or the ox or any of these animals that we have. Now, as the animals ate, they had the turkey, but again, only wild ones. They had the deer, the elk, the moose, the buffalo. Now, about how advanced they were. In South America, you have long straight lines called the Nazca lines. Long straight lines, N-A-Z-C-A. And folk, there are persons who say that you cannot build a long straight line from the ground. When we can do it with laser technology, but we don't know how they built these straight lines that go over the horizon. If you're on the ground and you run into a Nazca line, you probably won't even realize you run into one. When you get in an airplane, look down, you can see them clearly. The Nazca lines, so some of them in the shape of an animal, some in the shape of a squirrel, an owl, but there's a squirrel that's so large that you cannot see it from any one vantage point on Earth. And even the authors of this book right here the only place there is, they say that there are persons who believe that the Nazca lines were directed by someone from space looking down and directing the radio. I'll leave it at that. We don't know how they built them, folk. Now, the point I'm making, and this is something I said in the other class, our very, very, very ancient ancestors were not primitive. They were extremely high. I mean, the pyramids, for instance, in Egypt, we cannot move the blocks that we used to build. We know that some of these 50-ton blocks were quarried up to 1,000 miles away in Africa, and the blocks moved with no trail left behind. We can't lift them with our machinery. No trail.
There are ways of doing it. It's just, it's not with one single man. It's a team effort with, putting logs on the floor, rolling.
Okay, keep in mind there were no forests in Egypt. Haven't been in 2,000 years. So where do you get the logs?
Maybe there were pillars made out of clear cement, how they-
Yeah, okay, go ahead and speculate. But then how do you raise them up 200 feet? The great reformer, how do you raise them
I don't know
200 feet?
how they did it. It's just
I don't know how they
suggestion.
did it either. What I'm saying is, we can't do it.
So who
With
you
our
saying
machinery.
created the NASA lines? Who you saying?
Who created the Nazca lines?
The what? Oh, okay. Huge mystery, just like who built the Stonehenge. It's a huge mystery. It indicates, I mean, again, folks, there are some people who say that we were visited by alien creatures one time. A man named Dana Holt has written books about this. It is a huge mystery. We don't know how it was done. We don't know how it could have been done. Just a huge, huge mystery. But again, it indicates, all right, here's the point I'm making. When the Europeans discovered, I'm talking about now here in Georgia, we find here in Georgia and Tennessee in the South that the Indians who lived around the time of Christ, or around the year zero, were much more advanced than the ones who we saw in the late 14 or 1500s. They had a lot more population. They had trade. We find artifacts from Minnesota in Florida, and artifacts from Florida in Minnesota. They had trade that went on. They had, they had large cities with a lot of population. Over time, instead of going upward, they declined, which leads me to believe what I originally said, that they possibly would have died had the Europeans not come in and saved them from extinction. They were destroying themselves. And what was destroyed? Number one, the wars they were fighting among themselves, but number two, the fact that their women would not have babies. And number three, their own communistic ideology. They were destroying themselves. All right. So much for that. I've got to move on. Does anybody have any further questions or comments about the? Yes.
Can you, in a nutshell, tell me again what Bering Strait was?
The Bering Strait was this narrow strip right here of water between Siberia and Alaska. It's the nearest that any part of North America comes to the mainland rest of the world.
Invisible bears.
Yeah, in other words, Siberia. But again, keep in mind, Siberia is mostly frozen and uninhabited. But nevertheless, there's the standard view is that the Indians came across, because this is the nearest place where that Siberia, where that the old world touches the new. All right.
That's the Barents.
That's the Bering, yeah, you know where, yeah, that's the Bering Strait.
That tiny-
Where Siberia almost touches
That's like where America, this is Alaska.
Africa.
Not many people-
I mean, almost touches
This is where America
Siberia.
And
That's
the
Russia.
Indians
Right here
came
in
from
Asia, that's
Siberia?
the Americans almost touch. I mean, see, here's my world map. Let me see if I can show it better here. All right. The Bering Strait is this region right here, where that Siberia almost touches Alaska.
Circle around.
Almost.
And that would be the Barents.
Yeah.
This
Very, yeah.
Bering Strait.
And now, there is something else your book mentions that I want to mention about the world.
Is that
All
region-
of your continents were once joined together into one big supercontinent called Pangaea.
Pangea?
Pangaea, whatever, Pan. And Pan means the word all. And they split. We now know that the continents sit on tectonic plates, and they are capable of moving. But one big supercontinent, but then North and South America joined hard against Europe and Africa, and Australia joined to Africa, and Antarctica joined where South America and Africa was touching each other. And then they split in the different directions, with Antarctica going and eventually becoming right over the South Pole. And then Australia went on to the east and sits in the east by itself, kind of isolated from the rest of the world. And then India, though, is unique, and India actually bumped into the southern part of Asia and pushed up the Himalayan mountains. So that makes India unique. But North America split off from Europe, and South America split off from Africa. And eventually, North and South America touched each other. They didn't originally, but eventually in the course of their running around, you might say they collided to where a small part of North America hit a small part of South America, and they touch. And as for North America, it almost moved far enough to bump into Asia, but it didn't. That's the place where it didn't is called the Bering Straits. Okay.
Oh, wait, say that last, what you just said?
The place where that North and South America did not, where that North America did not hit Siberia is called the Bering Straits. But North America almost moved far enough to hit Siberia, but it didn't. All right, I'm going to move on to chapter 2. Chapter 1, the Indians. Chapter 2, Columbus. Now your book, I'm looking at page 25, your book does mention that in the year 1000, a bunch of Norsemen came across, led by Leif Erikson, don't worry about the name. The Norsemen did not become aware of the rest of North America, but they didn't stay long either. All right. Long about the year 1490, you had Europe's two western countries, Spain and Portugal. They were a lot alike, but they had been separated by mountains, and eventually Spain tried to conquer Portugal but couldn't. By the time the Spanish army got over the mountains, it lost a lot of men and a lot of equipment, and the Portuguese were ready for them, and Portugal won the fight. So Portugal remained separate. But Portugal and Spain led the way for Europeans, and it was logical because Spain and Portugal are on the end of Europe, western end of Europe. Portuguese tried to go around Africa, but in the meantime, a man named Columbus married into Portuguese royalty. He married the adopted daughter of Prince Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator was the fourth son of the King of Portugal.
Henry the Navigator?
Yeah. He never became king, even though he was a prince. He was the fourth son of the King of Portugal, so that's why I had the title of Prince. Prince Henry. And he had adopted a noble girl whose parents had died. So he adopted a girl, and Columbus married this girl. So that meant that Columbus had access to royalty.
And he married her as adopted daughter.
Columbus married Prince Henry's adopted daughter. And again, this meant that Columbus could go before kings because he had married into royalty. He married Prince Henry's adopted daughter, who was herself a noble. The girl was of noble birth. Columbus first went to the King of Portugal. The King of Portugal would not accept him, or would not believe him. But the King of Portugal secretly sent a ship out to the west. We now know the ship did not go far enough. The ship came back and said there was nothing there we tried to see. And Columbus, when he found it, he was very furious. So Columbus went to the King and Queen of Spain. Now, Spain was ruled by two monarchs, the King and Queen. Isabella was Queen of Castile, the bigger kingdom, and Ferdinand was King of Aragon, the smaller kingdom. That meant that they were independent monarchs. So what Isabella did with her realm, Ferdinand couldn't say anything against it. Anyway, Columbus went before Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand was not interested, but Ferdinand did consult with the doctors at his university, and the doctors at his university said, no, Your Majesty, it's a 10,000-mile trip. our ships can never carry enough food and water for the crew to survive. They'd perish along the way, which was true. It was a 10,000-mile trip from Europe to China. But they were not aware of the North and South American continents, of course. They told the king that the earth is much bigger than Columbus has imagined. Columbus only believed the earth was 15,000 miles in circumference. We now know it was 25,000. Ferdinand's scholars knew it was 25,000 miles, and they said, no, to get to China by sailing west, it could be done, but we'd have to carry enough food and water before the ships would sink. So it can't. Basically, they were saying that we can't do it. Well, Queen Isabella now had on her staff a Jew who was very wealthy, who was a converted. He was a Jew, but he was a converted Christian. He was her treasurer. This Christian man said, this converted Christian said, Your Majesty, I can finance the whole expedition out of my own pockets. Just let me finance it, and you okay it. Well, Queen Isabella agreed to that. So Queen Isabella gave Columbus 3 ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. And these 3 ships eventually were outfitted, to make a long story short, they were eventually outfitted and sailed west. And they started after a while to see birds flying and knew, well, these birds couldn't fly far from land. And they started seeing sticks rolling in, sticks floating in the water. And some of the sticks had green leaves on, so they said, we must be getting close. And then one day, the man on the top mast, the Santa Maria, which was the biggest ship, said, I see a light. We don't know what he saw. It's whatever he saw, he couldn't have seen a real light, because the Indians did not have that kind of light either. He said, I see a light, so Columbus ordered them to go to the light, and the next day they found this island. For the next 400 years, we never knew where the island was, but today we're pretty certain we know, because we found Spanish artifacts on that island. It was an island in the Bahamas, and he met the natives. The natives wore gold. They had gold. But Columbus wondered, well, where's the wealth that Marco Polo talked about? He called the people Indians because he believed he was in India. The Indians directed him to another island, so Columbus went to the island of Hispaniola, one of the bigger islands. There his big ship, the Santa Maria, was wrecked. Now here's part of the bad story about it. Queen Isabella could only get convicted criminals to go with Columbus and say, here, if you'll go with him, I'll pardon you of all your crimes and you'll be free when you get back. And also, some of the men who went along were too young, and on a night that the Santa Maria was dashed to pieces, Columbus had an 11-year-old boy operating the ship's steering wheel, you might say, the helm. And this 11-year-old boy couldn't manage it. He came to a place where the 2 seas came together. I'm not sure even a grown man could have managed that. And the Santa Maria was dashed to pieces. So Columbus left some of his men behind. He took 7 Indians with their gold and went back to Spain. When Columbus got back to Spain with his 2 ships, the king and queen and everybody was very excited. So this time Columbus went back with 17 ships. And this was not like the Vikings. I mean, unlike the Vikings, this time kings were involved. And kings meant armies, navies. By this time also Europe had the cannon, the rifle, gunpowder, which the Vikings didn't have. Now folk, when the Europeans got back to where they left the other men who they left behind, they found them all dead. You can call Columbus a mass murderer, but it looks 2 things I want to say about it. Number one, the first blood appears to have been drawn by the Indians. And secondly, the fighting went on until the Indians quit fighting.
But they still think of
When the Indians stopped, the Europeans stopped. If you don't like that, go ahead and say so. The fighting stopped when the Europeans stopped. When the fighting stopped when the Indians stopped. Anyway, this led to 400 years of conflict between Native American and European that was to end with the European being badly, but the Indian being badly damaged. Well, the Spanish began looking for gold. They found a little bit, but then they found out that they could get a lot of money by trading in things like tea and sugar and coffee and spices, tapioca, and tobacco. What's that?
This was the Spanish.
The Spanish, yeah. The Spanish found that they could grow these things. I mean, they could put these things on plantations, something the Indians never did. and grow these things in large quantities, and then take them, carry them a ship back to Europe, and make a lot of money off of these things.
Am I repeating that lesson?
Well, some of the things were tapioca, spices, coffee, tea, corn, tobacco. None of these things had been known to the Europeans before this time.
And where did they find them?
They met the Indians had them. So the Europeans then set up big plantations. And where they started growing sugar, I know I mentioned sugar one, where they started growing sugar plantation, sugar cane, and where they started growing tobacco and growing all the stuff that the Europeans would buy. Eventually they started growing bananas, but they did not know that they didn't have the means of getting bananas across the Atlantic. Bananas would perish before they got it.
So,
But that came
sorry
later.
to cut you off. Are we talking about the Indians back in chapter 1, or are we talking about when we went to the Bahamas?
When he went to the Bahamas.
Okay.
Yeah, this
Okay.
was all in the Bahamas. Now, we're talking chapter 3 about what happened with the United States. We get to see, but we just can't leave out what was going on in the Bahamas. I mean, I know the Bahamas were not quite, we simply can't leave it out because it helps us understand what was eventually happening in the
So
United
at what
States.
point did the conquistadors come over?
The conquistadors were the Spanish.
Were the Spanish? Those
Yeah, they were the Spanish, and they were the word that's been called in Spanish, conquistador means Spanish. They were the Spanish, and they came over, and they basically they made havoc with the Indians. Again, each of you can decide for yourself the morality of the situation. My own personal take on it, and I'll repeat it, is the persons who practice human sacrifice, persons who practice communism, have to take the consequences for what they do. All right, again, each of you, though, can make up your mind for yourself. Now, Columbus may have died without realizing he discovered a new world. Eventually, he was to make 4 trips over to the New World, and in one of them, he discovered South America. Columbus never saw what is today the United States. He never saw North America at all, never saw Mexico, but he did discover several islands, including the island of Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and some of the Bahama Islands. And he did bump into South America one time. But he possibly died without realizing whether he had ever discovered anything new. Your book goes on to talk about the Columbian Exchange, how that these goods from the New World found their way to the Old, the goods I've already named, the foodstuffs that could survive the trip. And again, I did not mention bananas because bananas could not survive the trip across the Atlantic in those days. Now today it's different. Today we've learned if you pick the bananas green, they'll ripen on the way over. But also our ships are much faster than those were too. But coffee and tea and that stuff would survive the trip across the Atlantic. Now, in order to get labor for the plantations, the Europeans resorted to trying to enslave the Indians. The Indians did not make good slaves. For one thing, they knew the territory, they knew where to run away and hide. So Europeans, and folk, this is part of the story I didn't wish, but I'm not going to cover it up. It happened. The Europeans resorted to taking Africans and getting Africans from Africa. Africans had raised cattle, so they had some immunity to smallpox and typhus. And also the Africans did not know where to run away and hide either. So those 2 factors meant that the Africans were taken away by the actually by the hundreds of thousands, and maybe by the millions. And this was to lead to slavery. I'm looking at page 32, but actually I'm a little bit beyond that. Your book shows a picture of smallpox victims on page 33. Now, anyway, I'm now looking at page 42. One thing that was going on in Europe about this time, same time, was a man named Martin Luther who was spreading a new doctrine among European Christians. the doctrine of justification by faith instead of justification by works. And Martin Luther was getting a large following, and eventually the Catholic Church realized they could not stop all Protestants, that they had to, at some point, come to terms with the Protestants. But where this affected the New World is that a lot of Protestants who were persecuted back in the Old World found refuge in the New World, and this was to continue on for several hundred years. Now, there was a lot, not only of the Protestant, but there was a lot of gold that also found its way into Europe from the New World, and silver, gold and silver. The New World had a lot of both. Here's a story of gold in the Old World. In Roman times, much of Europe's gold had found its way to China due to the Silk Road. The Silk Road was the road that joined China to the Mediterranean. As far as we know, no Chinese person ever went to Europe, and no European ever went to China at this time, except for Marco Polo. But what they did, on the trail, the spice trail, the China trail, what they did on this trail was they would deliver the goods for a few hundred miles and sell them to another merchant who would carry them a few hundred more miles. And the Silk Road, that's what I was trying to think, Silk Road. The Silk Road, by the time these goods got to Europe, the price was really, really high, because every middleman between China and Europe would jack up the price. I mean, they had to make a profit. So Europeans then were using their gold, and to this day, you can find a lot of Roman coins in India and China. This gold from Europe found its way to China and never found its way back. So the gold in Europe went to China, and for hundreds of years, Europe was largely without gold. Then came Columbus, and all of a sudden, Europe had a lot of gold and silver, and a lot of persons who claimed that the Europeans stole their wealth from the Native Americans. Some of that is justified. I'm not going to cover it up. I'm not going to make it sound like it. Some of it's justified. A lot of it was, but then again, in the long run, though, the whole world has benefited from what the Europeans did. So, and I can't imagine the Indians ever having done anything like inventing an automobile, inventing an airplane, inventing a radio or a television, or discovering cures for vaccinations for smallpox. They simply would not have. Mankind has benefited in the long run. And if you believe that Europeans should have left the Native Americans alone, you simply do not, to me, you're living in an unreal world. The world of unreality. In the real world, if people can take it from you, they will. The only reason that foreign countries do not come in right now and take everything we have is we have an army. That still is strong enough to keep them out. I don't know how much longer that will be true. But without the army, they would take it. All right. Okay. One thing, now your book mentions that the Europeans vowed to stop Protestantism, and they felt like they had the money to do it by the gold they got from the New World. It didn't work. Okay. One of the wars that happened was a war between King Philip and Queen Elizabeth I. King Philip sent a fleet of ships to England to conquer. That's known as the Spanish Armada. It was 100 ships that King Philip of Spain sent to conquer England. His job was to depose the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I and bring England, the Protestant England, back into the Catholic Church. A big gale came up, and the gale was of such a size it did not terrify the experienced British sailors in the smaller ships, But the Spanish galleons were top heavy. If you ever seen a Spanish ship called a galley, I'll be right with you. And the Spanish galleons were destroyed during the gale. Yes.
Now King Philip wanted England to come back to the
Yeah, in other words,
Catholic
England had left the Catholic Church.
Church. Okay.
England left the Catholic Church, and King Philip was determined to get them back. And again, here's what the story of Spain. Spain, after it stole this silver and gold from the New World, and I'm going to use the word steal, I mean it was, England became the richest country in Europe. But what happened was the people of Spain became the richest country in Europe after Spain had stolen the gold. Sorry for confusing you. Spain stole the gold, became the richest country in Europe. And then they started spending their money, and in short order their gold all left them. They started spending it. Also, inflation. I mean, when you have too much money, the price of everything goes up. Inflation made Spanish products impossible to buy, so they couldn't sell it abroad, and eventually Spain became the poorest country in Europe. But when Spain lost its armada in 1588, that, along with some bad economics and some bad kings about that time, Spain went into a state of poverty. I mean, hey, they went from being the richest nation in Europe to poverty, and they are still there to this day. They never recovered from the losses in 1588. All right. Now I'm going to move on to chapter 3. Chapter 2 is about the conquistadors. Yes?
Oh, do we have to memorize things? Do we have to memorize things?
I have not mentioned one. I've not written one on the board. I mentioned the day 1588, 1492. All right, I've mentioned it. I've not written one on the board. There is one I really think you ought to know, though, and that's 1492, the year Columbus sailed across the ocean. All right, the southern colonies. Chapter 3 is about the south, chapter 4 about the north. Now, I want to say this. I know this from experience. A friend of mine joined the Army one time, and he had two sergeants, one of them from the south and one of them from the north. At first, he liked his southern sergeant better. His southern sergeant seemed friendly. His northern sergeant had a lot of flair to him, but he wound up liking his northern sergeant better.
What sergeant?
Here's why. He said, with a northern sergeant, he always knew where you stood. With his northern sergeant, when you did something he didn't like, once he had said his lines, he forgot about it was over. The southern sergeant would act like, oh, everything's okay, but then you found out he was working against you behind the scenes, keeping you from promotions, and that he really didn't like you. But he was pretending to be your friend to your face. And he wound up, he said, liking his northern sergeant better because he always knew where he stood with him. With the southern sergeant, he couldn't tell where he stood. All right, I'll leave that. There's a lot of folk that, I've been in both places. I mean, I'm from the north, and I've moved to the south. And southern people can fool you sometimes. Make you think they're your friend, but they're not. All right, we're going to be talking much of the rest of the first part is about the south and the north. Eventually, the south and the north were to have serious differences that was to lead to a big war we call the Civil War. Very serious differences. And a lot of scholars believe that the reason was the two sides just didn't understand each other. I mean, they fought over slavery and all true, but they just didn't understand each other. Now, a man named Sir Walter Raleigh. Sir Walter Raleigh was trying to get favor of Queen Elizabeth I. This is the one who defeated King Philip of Spain. But Sir Walter Raleigh had a dream that someday, he said, North America is going to be filled with English-speaking people. Well, we know this dream eventually came to pass. But he didn't have the money to do it. Somebody felt like, if I can get in favor of the Queen, she'll give me the money to start a colony in North America. So Sir Walter Raleigh was walking in London, and the Queen was walking in her royal slippers and came to a mud puddle. Well, she couldn't get around the puddle. The puddle covered both sides of the streets. If she stepped into the puddle, she'd ruin her royal slippers. Sir Walter Raleigh came over and pulled off his coat, threw his coat down on the ground and said, "Step across, Your Majesty." And the Queen was able to walk across Sir Walter Raleigh's coat without ruining her slippers. She invited him to her palace, and he became like a favorite of hers at court. He told her, "Your Majesty, I would like to start a colony in North America." The Queen agreed to it, so Sir Walter Raleigh started a colony. A baby was born named Virginia Dare. Sir Walter Raleigh went back home. Then a war was going on, and he couldn't come back. When he came back, he found that the colony had started to disappear. There were no colony. As to what happened to Virginia Dare, big mystery. We simply don't know what happened to Virginia Dare and what happened to the colony of Rome. The most likely explanation is that they were destroyed by Indians with whom they could not get along. But anyway, the first attempts of Europeans to settle in North America failed. Part of it because they picked really bad places to settle, mosquito-infested and malaria-infested areas. But finally, in 1607, don't worry about the date, Jamestown. I've got to digress here. In 1907, we celebrated the 400th year of the founding of the original colony, and Queen Elizabeth herself came over. This was a different Elizabeth, of course. This was Elizabeth II, wasn't it? Yeah, we celebrated at the Jamestown colony. 400 years, see, 1607, 1907, and the Queen. I mean, the Queen at the time. Anyway, but the Queen came over, but it was not the same Elizabeth, obviously. Today's Queen called herself Elizabeth II. That's because the original Elizabeth I lived 400 years before. I mean, because she was the original queen with that name. Anyway, Jamestown was the first English settlement that lasted. It's still there, and if you go to Jamestown today, you'll find people dressed the way they did at the time, and they have women who sew clothes the way they did at the time, and wear clothes the way they did at the time, and who fix food the way they did at that time. Of course, they don't have mosquitoes. They keep the mosquitoes away. They keep the bugs away. But now the Jamestown colony had a hard time getting off the ground, and they almost starved to death. In fact, a lot of them did starve. But finally, they got a man named John Smith to come in, and John Smith said to them all, "We all work." Now, this is very important because a lot of the people who came over were gentlemen. They were part of the nobility, and nobles don't work. But John Smith said, "I don't care what your ancestry was. He who will not work will not eat." He was going to buy. Well, basically said, if you don't want to work, you're going to starve. And he enforced it. People didn't like John Smith, and John Smith was eventually hurt in a gunpowder accident. Some people think it was deliberate. John Smith had to go back to England. But the Jamestown colony lasted. Eventually other colonies were started. Near the Jamestown colony lived the great chief Powhatan. Powhatan had conquered a lot of other Indian tribes and built himself a nation. And one of his daughters was a girl named Pocahontas. Pocahontas had first married an Indian. She is credited with saving John Smith's life, but some people think she was going and reenacting a ceremony where John Smith was being adopted into the Indian tribe. Be that as it may, Pocahontas eventually married an Englishman named John Wolfe. And today there are millions of Americans who claim, and some of them would justifiably claim, they're descended from Pocahontas and John Wolfe. We know that this child of Pocahontas grew up and had a lot of children, and they had more children. Now, I want to say this, not very many Englishmen married Indian women. But the Spanish now, south of the border, they've mixed the races a lot more. I mean, the blacks and whites and Indians all intermixed, and they became a mixture. Among the Europeans, among the English, this did not happen as much. Eventually, inevitably, slaves were brought into the Virginia colony also. In the year 1619, three things happened. Don't worry about the year, but slaves were brought over, women were brought over, and the people of Virginia met, and it was the beginning of democracy. They met in a legislative type session to discuss their rules and regulations and their problems. This was the beginning of democracy. Women, inevitably they had to bring women. Now, the problem that the Virginia colony had initially was for many, many years, the men outnumbered the women by, several to one. there were not very many women to go around. Now, this was not true in the northern colonies. It came later. Another problem the southern colonies had was there were a whole lot more diseases owing to the fact that there were more mosquitoes. Anyway, years went by, and eventually a ship came from England intending to go to Virginia, but a big storm came and blew this ship up to Massachusetts, and it was the best thing that happened to it because in Massachusetts there were no mosquitoes, or very few, and that meant that the people of Massachusetts lived a lot longer, and they had an equality between men and women as far as numbers, because this ship had an equal number of men and women. But that was the start of the northern colony. That's something we'll discuss in the next chapter. But the Southerners, one of the things they want to do is look for gold. Now, if you look on a map, when the Spanish hit North America, they went across the Isthmus of Panama right here. And right here is here is the Gulf of Mexico, and here is the Pacific Ocean. Only 50 miles separate the Gulf of Mexico from the Pacific.
I mean,
About 50 miles. Well, the people of Virginia thought that, hey, this North America is very, very narrow. If we just go over a few mountains, I mean, all right, the Spanish climbed them. Every time they come a mountain, Balboa would say to me, you stay back here, I want to be the first person to see the top of the mountain. So he wanted to, the Indians had told him that there was an ocean, which there was. So he was the first person to spot the Pacific Ocean because he climbed the mountains ahead of his men. Well, the English thought that Virginia is only about 50 miles wide. That was Balboa. Don't worry about the name. But anyway, the English thought that if we just get across the mountains of Virginia, on the other side of the mountains of Virginia, we'd the Pacific Ocean. They didn't know they had to go through 3,000 miles of territory. They never, by the way, the Virginians never did find the Pacific Ocean. Today we don't want it. Too wide. But it was really narrow down there in Panama. Called the Isthmus. Yeah, don't worry about the word Isthmus of Panama. Very narrow. But anyway, the English were looking for gold. They eventually found some, and guess where they found it? Nearby here in North Georgia and Delaware. But that was to come many, many years later. We never found the gold in this country that they found in South America. Never. We didn't find the silver in this until we got to New Mexico. We didn't find the silver in this country that they had that the Spanish found. The Spanish found all the silver and gold, but instead of making them rich, it made them poor, which is the way money does to people sometimes. Anyway, one thing the Indians did to help the English, the Indians taught the English how to grow in this country. If you know anything at all about farming in North America, you have to use fertilizers. This was something that the English did not realize. But the Indians said, now here, catch some fish, put the fish in the ground. They used fish as fertilizers, and used fertilizers. So they caught the fish, used the fish as fertilizers, and it's taught them that other stuff to be used for. But you cannot farm in North America without fertilizers, and that's still true 400 years later. The Jamestown colony was extremely, extremely fragile, and when the Europeans spread out the Jamestown colony, they eventually found other places that were better to settle. Now, one of the things that John Wolfe, R-O-L-F-E, the man who married Pocahontas, discovered something the Indians never would have. I mean, these Indians were not innovative. He mixed two strains of tobacco together, this kind, and produced a hybrid that was better tobacco than any that the Indians had. And this tobacco could survive the trip across the Atlantic, and he began selling tobacco to the Europeans. And the tobacco trade made the Virginia colony somewhat prosperous. Now, as much as I'm against tobacco use, I mean, I hate to say it, but this is just simply in the records. At the time, they did not realize that tobacco use was probably going to cause them cancer, and it was they knew it was highly addictive. In fact, King James, who followed Elizabeth, said, I don't want anybody to smoke in my court. Smoking is dangerous, smoking is evil, and smoking is odious. And I don't want it in my court. And he would not allow it in his court. Sir Walter Raleigh had smoked in Queen Elizabeth's court. But again, in those days, they said that tobacco would open up your breathing passageways and make you snore less and sleep better at night. Some of this might have been a little bit true. You know, tobacco use won't help you lose weight. But at a terrible, terrible price. Hopefully none of you know what I'm talking about.
Over 10 years.
Anyway. Yeah. No, I mean, after all the teaching I did to my son about tobacco, one of his friends said, here, take a puff. It won't hurt you. And he got hooked. And he still hooked 2 years later. It's destroyed his pocket. And I don't know what all the damage is doing to him. He told me last time I talked about it, he knows what addiction is. I told him, I think we carry a gene for addiction in my family. I mean, I'll tell you the truth. I believe that I'm what you call a dry alcoholic. I believe it most of my life. An alcoholic who never took a drink, but or take one. I'll give it a it. If anyone was a dry alcoholic, my dad was. He never touched it. But if he would have, oh no. You're a dry alcoholic if you're getting addicted to things like computer card games. Or if you get addicted to sugary snacks. I mean, to the point where you can't help yourself. Or if you go through one failed relationship after another, it's totally your fault. And my life didn't come together until, hey, the problems I'm having in my life, my biggest enemy is me. My fault. When I got to that point, I started getting my life together. But I suspect, and I have all that I'm a dry alcoholic. My dad was too. And one thing, well, his father never touched it, but his father's brother did, my great uncle Sam, and he had a problem with it. One of my nephews started drinking, he got a problem. One of my brothers started drinking in the army. He had a problem with it. I didn't drink when I was in the army. But when my brother did, he developed a problem with it. Anyway, leaving that, it's tobacco, highly addictive. Your book talks a lot about it, and again, it was a big thing now, tobacco requires a lot of help, a lot of labor. And guess what, folk? They wound up importing slaves. Now, well, they've got two things that they use in this Southern colony: indentured servants. An indentured servant was a very, very poor person in the old world who didn't feel like he had a chance. They'd tell this young man, and sometimes young woman, if you go to the colonies and work for something like 7 years, when you get through, we'll give you a bunch of land. Life was so rough, though, that a lot of persons didn't survive that long. But a lot of the people who came into the country, to the South, and first were indentured servants. They started out very, very poor. And then when the indentured servants did not come in big enough numbers for them, they started bringing in slaves from Africa. Now, some of the slaves came from the West Indies, where the Spanish had also. Some of the slaves were brought in from the Spanish, who were living in the West Indies, and some of them came directly from Africa. The slave trade, the slavery was to become a big issue from 1619, when the first ones were brought over, until, well, not until the present time.
This happened before the slave trade?
The slave trade began, okay, the Spanish brought the slaves over first. And then some of the slaves that found their way into what is today the United States, or into Virginia, some of them came from the West Indies. And
Right, and then servants were who?
oh, the indentured servants were white Englishmen
Okay.
who'd grown up in poverty and who didn't have a chance.
And were coming from where?
They came from England.
Okay, and going where?
They went to Virginia.
Okay.
Yeah, they went from England to Virginia. Now, eventually they settled in the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, and at one time they lumped the Carolinas together before they became two separate territories.
England to Virginia?
But the first colonies were in Virginia. But eventually they settled in the Carolinas. North Carolina and Carolina and South Carolina. All right, now we've been going an hour and a half. All right, I'll tell you what, folks. Everybody take about a 10-minute break. Be back by 2:41. I need to take this up. Now, let me ask you something. If you could move to one side, I'm going to try to do something. I'm going to try to get this thing off. Or do you want to try it?
Right up there, that blackboard.
But, yeah, you're taller than I am, I believe.
There you go.
All right, thank you. Because the school has told me that thing costs $200, and please not run it when I'm not using it.
Well,
Well,
the switch right next to this black.
okay, well, somebody will figure out how to get it back on.
Yes.
Somebody will, but for the meantime, it's
Don't
off.
follow the
All right,
tech.
thank you much. All right. These brakes, by the way, are legal.
It's so hard because he all over. Trying to catch up with them.
He's trying to do it quick, like
I
you said.
know.
He's got like, what does he got?
7 weeks.
7 weeks, right, to teach us 15 weeks worth of work.
That's right. You know, he's trying to go as fast as possible. You know. And it seems like his tests are very good. They'll be very easy. They're gonna be multiple choice as well.
Lots of
I
fun
feel
with
it.
75 questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not that difficult. They're gonna be multiple choice, and half of them are yes, no, true or false questions. So, you know.
He just writing names on the board. We're just supposed to look up this person or.
I think
Oh,
we're
yeah.
gonna be doing working online a lot in this class too.
Yeah, this is a hybrid class, so some of it's gonna be online, but I don't think he's gonna do that. I don't know. I hope he does.
I'm like, we're gonna
I
learn
really hope
everything
the
today
online
that's gonna be on
doesn't-
the test on
No,
Friday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you just writing some things on the board that you said that we have to know, like James.
Yeah, in other
Have to
words,
read
yeah,
them.
know that Jamestown was in Virginia with the first permanent, not the first settlement, but the first permanent English settlement. Now, the oldest city is St. Augustine in Florida, but St. Augustine started as a Spanish city. But the first permanent English, and that's important because the English wound up becoming the dominant group in this country. I mean, whether they should have or not, they did. Oh, you see that note I wrote on the board?
Yeah.
I saw it. I got it.
All right.
I'll email you later.
All right, yeah, I'll do that. I probably won't be home till 7 o'clock, because once I'm through here, I've got to eat a supper, right? And then the traffic is gonna be off when it's Friday, but I knew that when I took that, but I mean, I at least went to the class, you know?
You
So I
live far
took a
from here?
Friday class, and guess what? The full-time faculty didn't take it from me. I have not seen one full-time history faculty today. Not even our department head came in. Not even Mr. Bennigan. None of them.
It's that summertime, they don't want it.
You know, the lady ahead of me, you know, is part-time herself, so
Vacation.
they don't want Friday, you know, so I take them.
I think it's the only time that I can come to class.
Well, hey, that's all right with me. I mean, you know, hey, it turns out to be the only time I can teach a class, so maybe we can get together. I am finding myself getting mixed up between English, Spanish, English, and
It's English at this point.
yeah, I'm getting a little bit tired. I'm going to admit to you, I'm getting a bit tired. I'll tell you something. It's no secret. I will turn 69 on Sunday. I'm not young.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. Yeah, I will turn 69. So in 367 days, I'll be 70 years old. And I can remember, well, see, my niece had her wedding last August, and a lot fell on me and my wife to take this old lady from the rest home to the wedding. Well, it turns out this woman I call an old lady is younger than I. She lives in a rest home because she cannot quite manage. She's got a few disabilities, but she's younger than I am. It was important that we take her there because she was to sing at the wedding, which she did. And then when it was over, we took her back home, and that saved me from having to disassemble everything in the gym, too. So my wife and I got out of that because we were carrying this little baby. I see it on the news every day. It's kind of scary. People dying who are younger than I am. Well, just today, a CNN reporter, 61 years old. Younger than me.
The designer, Kate Spade or something.
Yeah.
She can introduce it. Other stars. Lord, Diana. She just.
You never know what's going on with people's lives. They got all this money.
Money don't mean anything
I know.
behind closed doors.
I know it.
Behind closed doors, nobody knows what's going on. People can have money and they can look like the happiest people on TV. When they get home behind closed doors, they're yelling, fighting, screaming, killing. You know what I mean? Like, there's so much shit that happens in people's lives. You can't judge anybody. They have money. And they look at the shit they have. They don't want it. Facts.
Forget it. I've got to start the class. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, we're still in the south.
They came from England to West Virginia, to Virginia, and then they eventually moved out to North America. North and
Yeah,
South
there's some
Carolina.
of them, yeah. The one thing that the New World had at this time was lots and lots of land. However, eventually all of the land on the coastline was taken, and then they had to move, of course, farther west, and this became a problem in the north, particularly later. Your book mentions, too, that women were very, very rare in the Chesapeake Valley, I mean, the Chesapeake region. This was not true after 1680, but between 1607 and 1680, the colony was just about all men, and women were extremely rare.
What page are you currently on right
Now
now?
look at page 57,
Okay.
and then page 58. I turn to page 58. The indentured servanthood was very, very, a very rough life, to say the least, and a lot of the young men were not able to survive it that long. And it didn't help that they were living under unsanitary, filthy conditions and worked really, really hard and didn't get to take off as much as they want to. Now, England had become a Protestant country, and as much as I hate to say it, I'm going to lay it out the way it was. Catholics began to be persecuted in some part. Now that did not remain true for long, but for a time, Catholics in England were persecuted. Well, a Catholic man named Baltimore, Lord Baltimore, who was a member of the nobility, but he was still Catholic, decided he wanted to start a colony in the New World. So he went to the Chesapeake region and started what's called today the Maryland colony. And to this day, Baltimore has a lot of Catholics in it, as they originally were. The Protestants who were living in Virginia did not like them. And a lot of people in in what is today America did not like the Maryland colony at first because it was Catholic. But eventually, more and more Protestants moved into Maryland until most of your Catholics became confined to Baltimore. Now, I want to say this, I'm going to make it as clear as I can. I'm teaching about an anti-Catholic sentiment because it's history. I do not in any way at all intend to promote any kind of anti-Catholicism in this class. We're clear on that. But I'm not going to cover it up. It was a big part of American history, and it became acute when I was 11 years old in 1960, and a Catholic man was running for president of the United States named John F. Kennedy. And his name still makes the news a lot, especially when his brother was assassinated 50 years ago yesterday, or the day before, 50 years ago. So Robert Kennedy is making a lot of news, and John Kennedy has also made a lot of news. I'll have more to say about it later, of course. But anyway, there's a strong anti-Catholic sentiment running throughout our history. It came to the fore in the days before the Revolutionary War. It came to the fore in the 1850s, before the Civil War. And then it came to the fore again in the days of the Ku Klux Klan, because the Klan was not only against blacks, but hard against Catholics. The Klan was a Protestant organization. This is a fact. It's not, yes, I am anti-Klan. But the Klan was anti-Catholic also. Then there was a strong anti-Catholic sentiment that came across when John Kennedy was running for president. Today we don't hear much about it. Yeah, I voted for a Catholic man for president one time. I'm not supposed to tell you who, but I did vote for a Catholic president one time. All right. Anyway, the Maryland colony started out as a Catholic colony. Now, John who?
Robert Kennedy.
Yeah, in fact, that's when he was shot dead. See, he had won the California primary, but most experts believe he would not have quite gotten the nomination because Hubert Humphrey, the political bosses control the Democratic Party like they do today. And the political bosses can pick a candidate because of this thing about the super delegates. And anyway, so a lot of people say Robert Kennedy just won the California primary, and he was about to celebrate a big win because California gave him a lot of delegates when all of a sudden he was shot. And he died the next day. But yeah, he was running for president at the time, but he did not have the charisma that his brother did.
And
Or-
was his brother, was John?
His brother was John.
Too?
They're both Democrats.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they're both Democrats. But Robert Kennedy, one of our high school teacher, has said he's a man either you liked him or you didn't. He didn't have the looks his brother did, and he didn't have the charisma his brother did. And some people believe he could not quite have cut it.
So like,
Okay, now that is, okay, hey, believe me, I have spent a lot of my time studying the deaths of those two men. They found 12 bullet holes, and Sirhan's gun can only fire 8 shots. They got through it. I don't know why. And in the case of John Kennedy, oh my, they were supposed to release all the documents, and we have a president who at least keeps his word. He said, I'm going to release everything when I get to be president. And even he decided, no, there's some of this stuff I still have to keep. But what did they tell? They told that we tried to bump off Castro. Do you realize how serious that they told that? I mean, we now have documented proof that we tried to bump off Castro. Well, if they told, why do they keep it covered up? Johnson did it. I don't know that. Anyway, okay, I've gotten sidetracked. We got to get back on. All right. Now, we can talk more about this later. Because believe me, I'll have more to say about the Kennedys later. What your book says about the religious conflict in Virginia, in Maryland, eventually Maryland and Virginia became a lot alike. They both became plantation areas and slave states, and the differences became more and more. True, Virginia was primarily Protestant and Maryland primarily Catholic, but they both had the same problems and the same issues, and they needed to cooperate with each other in order to thrive. So eventually they put aside their differences and began to work together. Catholics continued to be very strong in Maryland, but the colonies of Maryland and Virginia became almost indistinguishable from each other. Now you're going to be introduced to a word called polarization. We're going to see that word a lot in this book until at least the Civil War. Polarization means that two sides become so far apart that they cannot get together anymore. In this case, it was social polarization. What it's saying is that in the South, the rich became very, very, very rich, and at the bottom were the poor who became very, very, very poor. And this was to characterize the South until fairly recent times, even as recently as when I was a child. Now today we have different levels of social classes in the South today, but I mean you have your very rich and very poor. But what I'm saying is there are only the very rich and the very poor, and nobody in between. Today we have the moderate people like myself, who are neither very rich nor very poor, but somewhere in between. But if I'd lived in the South 75 years ago, I'd have probably been very, very, very poor, with no chance of bettering myself. But that's not. But the polarization was to become a factor of Southern way of life for the next 300 or so years. Social polarization, where that the rich were very and the poor were very poor, and
Life for how long?
this was to last about 300 or so years, even long after the Civil War. Social polarization. Now, the Navigation Acts of 1650, and this can become very important later. I'm not going to write it down. It won't be until the Navigation Act said that all goods that came to or from the colonies had to be transported on English ships. In other words, no colonial goods were to be transported on French ships. Basically, every bit of tobacco you sold was to be loaded on an English ship, and if a French ship docked, we could not offload anything from it. I mean, we had to send it on its way. This was one of the things that was to lead to war between the United States and Great Britain. Hopefully all of you know, the United States eventually went to war with England. Great Britain. And the Navigation Acts was the beginning. And now the first rebellion that we have known, that we know about, that occurred was called Bacon's Rebellion. This one I will write down.
Thank you.
Essentially, a man named Bacon led a rebellion against the governor of Virginia. Bacon developed dysentery and died. I mean, the people were always close to death in those days. I mean, not that we still aren't, but the people were always really close to dying in those days. So Bacon died, and his followers were hung by the governor, 13 of them. When the King of England heard it, he became very upset at the governor and required the governor to give an explanation. Why would you hang 13 people in this, who were poor anyway? The governor, of course, had to give a reply. The whole thing wound up becoming not a rebellion against the government, but a fight against the Indians. The people who got together with their weapons turned on the Indians instead, apart from, I guess, the best of reasons. But when the rebellion was over, the tension between the rich and poor moderated. Your book calls it tensions between the great planters and small farmers. In other words, you already had at this time your great planters who were very, very rich, your small farmers who were poor, and this was part of the reason for the rebellion. Your poor people were rebelling against the oppressive measures of their rich neighbors. And a lot of the rich neighbors started out very poor themselves, but happened to be in the right place, the right time, to gain a lot of wealth. And eventually, after the upper classes, the rich managed to turn the rebellion into an Indian fight. To keep the rebellion from happening again, though, the rich did give tax cuts to the poor, and that's always a popular move. Our present president has cut taxes. And the results, well, time will tell. All right. Then on page 63, I'm looking at page 63, slave labor. This was to become an issue that was to last to some extent to this day, and lead to racial tensions that I regret to say, folks, still are not solved.
You can't deny we have come a long way.
We've come a long way, yeah, but the tensions, and also what was surprising to a lot of folk, we thought that we'd really made a lot of progress. Then all of a sudden, within the last 6 or 8 years, we find out that the underlying tensions are still there. I mean, I got to be careful talking about modern times. But now I'll tell you something now. On a personal note,